Last week, we explored how electromagnets made for better sounding records. By using a phonograph cartridge to both make and play back records, much better sound quality was attainable through the now venerable disc. But electromagnets were far from finished showing off their awesomeness. As we learned more about what we could do with the electrical signal provided to us by microphones, we started to put electromagnets to a very different use: magnetic recording. I'm Alec, and this is Technology Connections. As is often the case for technological progress, tracing its history can be a bit complicated. The first magnetic recording device was invented by Valdemar Poulsen in the late 1890s. He received a patent for his design in 1900. Why haven't we talked about this before? Well, the simplest answer is that while his invention was early, it was never really put to use, especially not in the use of audio recording. Let's go through the original design though, just for kicks. He who must not be named invention was originally designed to be a dictation machine or a telegraph recorder. Called the telegraphone, it used a funny method of recording. It exploited a property of metals that could be magnetized. Here's what I mean. If some metals like iron and steel are exposed to a substantially strong magnetic field, the field will actually cause the metal itself to become slightly magnetic. This is called magnetization. It's useful in many applications. One you may have encountered is the common screwdriver. Screwdrivers are often magnetized so that screws will stick to their tips. The wire recorder used a long, thin wire that sat in a special device fitted with an electromagnetic coil. When current was passed through this coil, it created a magnetic field, just like in a loudspeaker's voice coil. But this coil was arranged so that the field it generated would be transferred into the wire. The wire was made of steel, which is a metal that can be magnetized. So as a current was passed through the special device, the wire itself would become magnetized, but only in the spot that was right next to the device. The rest of the wire would remain unaffected, so what you'd end up with is a wire with a single blip in the middle that's magnetized. But say we run the wire past this special device at a decent speed. Then we could change the magnetization in the wire over time. Say we're recording a telegraph signal, and the signal goes like this. If we send current through the coil while we are getting a signal, and we move the wire past the coil at a steady speed, we'll end up with a wire that is magnetized in a pattern that matches that signal. Okay, but what good does this do? Well, as I'm sure you remember, electromagnets also work in reverse. Just like how a loudspeaker is the opposite of a microphone, and how a phonograph cartridge can either record or play back records, this device can also detect magnetization in the wire. If we were to run the wire back through the device, the varying magnetic fields now surrounding the magnetized wire will induce a current in the coil. We can use that current to see what's on the wire after it's recorded, and thus we can play back a message. The wire was also capable of recording audio, but again, it was only of sufficient quality to be a dictation machine, and hardly anyone ever used them, as the dictaphone, a phonograph-based dictation machine, was far more popular. Plus, this was before the days of amplification, so the signals recorded onto the wire were made using telephone-style carbon microphones and could only be heard with an earpiece. Fast forward 45 years and we're near the end of World War II. Now the wire recorder is in vogue again because we can now easily adapt the technology to be used with electronic amplification. Not much really changed with the wire recorder itself, except the wire got thinner and the special device, which by the way is called the head, was now powered by a triode vacuum tube, often using electronics from a radio. And when the wire was played back, the signal coming from the head was amplified by the same circuitry and sent to a loudspeaker. Let's have a look at some recording wire. This spool contains over a mile of wire. That may seem ridiculous, but it's absolutely true. This stuff is so tremendously thin that you can barely see it, and it has to be thin in order to be practical. This 7,200-foot spool can hold about an hour's worth of material, and when running the wire past the head at the relatively standard speed of 24 inches per second, you'd get 3,600 seconds, or 1 hour. But being so thin presented some obvious problems. This stuff is fragile, and that's putting it lightly. If it came off the spool and unwound, you'd have no chance of getting it back on. It would instantly tangle and become an unmanageable mess. But if it did break, and you were lucky enough to have all the wire safely secure on both ends, you could mend the break with a simple square knot. You might lose a bit of material at the repair, perhaps half a second or so, but the knot could go right through the head without trouble. Wire recorders only stuck around for a few years because magnetic tape recorders were right around the corner. Earlier tape recorders, such as the Blattner phone, used solid metal tape, but you're probably much more familiar with a tape recorder that uses a flexible plastic tape. The German magnetophone was the first such machine to do so, developed in the 1930s. Tape recorders work exactly the same as wire recorders, the only real difference is in the tape itself. Tape recorders were so much easier to use than wire recorders that the wire recorder almost instantly disappeared. So what is in magnetic tape? The answer might surprise you. It's rust. That's why it's brown. Magnetic tape is made of a plastic film backing that has a coating of iron oxide powder on one side. Iron oxide is literally rust, as it's the result of the oxidation of iron. Iron oxide is easy to magnetize, so it became the obvious choice for making tape. By using a fine powder, magnetic tape was able to run at much slower speeds than wire. This was because the fine particles were magnetized individually, and thus you could get changes in magnetization closer together on the tape. This was important for high-frequency signals, which need to alter the magnetic field on the tape very rapidly. With wire, they couldn't get too close together, so the wire had to run at the very fast 24 inches per second. But tape only needed to go at 7.5 or even 3 3/4 inches per second to get the same quality of sound. Let's go into that a little deeper. Recording wire is a solid metal object, and because of this, when you magnetize one spot on it, the magnetization will sort of bleed into the areas next to it. That meant that the definition, that is the fineness of the points we can magnetize, is very large. So in a 24-inch section of wire, we can only effectively change the polarization of the field maybe 10,000 times. That may seem like a lot, but it means that we're limited to recording sounds up to that frequency, since these 10,000 changes will pass the head in 1 second, resulting in a 10,000 hertz noise. Because of the physical limitations of the wire, we cannot record sounds any higher than this. If we slow down the speed to 12 inches per second, now we can only fit half the detail on the wire. So in this case, the most detail we can fit is 5,000 changes per second, or 5,000 hertz, because only half the wire goes past the head in the same period of time. What this means is that as you slow down the wire, the sound becomes muddier because we can't record higher frequencies. The slower the wire travels past the head, the less detail we can get on it. And that's why the wire is absurdly thin and long. The only way to have it sound any good is to have it move past the head very quickly, and thus the only way to get a sufficiently long recording time on the wire is to have it be very, very long. But tape was completely different. Because it uses a powder of iron oxide, there were small particles that could be magnetized on their own. If we were to zoom in really far on this tape, we'd see these microscopic particles. When a point was magnetized on the tape, only the particles directly under the coil would become magnetized. There was still some bleed of magnetization like in the wire, but much less, so we could pack far more detail into this tape. What took 24 inches of space on a wire only took a few inches, maybe 2 or 3 on the tape. This meant that tape only 1,200 feet long could record an hour of material with better sound quality than the wire. If we increased the speed, we could make the recording even better. Tape came on reels like this, and while it's bulkier than wire, it's a hell of a lot easier to deal with. It's nowhere near as fragile as wire, and being larger, it's easier to handle. Tape was better than wire in every conceivable way, except one. The particles of iron oxide that make tape so useful also produce a side effect: noise. Because of the randomness inherent to the particles, there was always a slight magnetic field left between them. Even on a completely blank tape, this randomness can be heard. It manifests as a hiss, and this is what we call tape noise. There would soon be ways to deal with this noise, but we'll explore them later. So let's look into what using this new tape was like. This is a Sony TC366 tape recorder from 1970. It's a consumer model and thus it uses non-professional tape, but make no mistake, this machine records music with all the fidelity we expect today. But we'll talk about that later. Looking over the machine, you'll find lots of controls. It may look overwhelming, but once you understand how to use it, it makes perfect sense. The empty reel on the right is what's called the take-up reel. It takes up the tape after it passes the heads. A full reel of tape was placed on the left-hand side of the recorder, then it's threaded through the heads into the take-up reel. Speaking of the heads, let's take a look at those. Most machines like this have 3 heads. The tape first passes an erase head. This head is only enabled when recording, and its job is to record a very high frequency, past the limit of our hearing, and very strong signal onto the tape. This randomizes the magnetic field of the particles in the tape, and thus erases it. The second head is the record head. This one is also only used while recording, and it magnetizes the tape as it travels based upon the sound signal received by the tape deck. The third head is the playback head, and this head reads the sound recorded on the tape. Having 3 heads is not strictly necessary. Just like in a wire recorder, the record head could actually be used as a playback head. The tape heads work both ways, so really all we need is the erase head and a single record/playback head. But by having the playback head separate from the record head, you'd gain the advantage of being able to monitor your tape as you record it. These switches here change whether the headphones you're using are receiving the source you're recording or are receiving what's being picked up by the playback head. You'll hear it with a slight delay caused by the distance the tape has to travel between the heads, but it's an invaluable tool nonetheless because it allows you to monitor the actual record levels on the tape. Record levels? So here's something to keep in mind about tape. There is in fact a limit to how much we can magnetize it. Once we get past a certain threshold, it can't take any more volume and the recording will become distorted. To help you figure out how much you can put on the tape or how much you can saturate the tape are these level meters. They're usually marked VU or volume unit. The scale goes from -infinity to 0, and then we meet a red line. 0 is full saturation, and going higher than that pushes the boundaries of what you can record. With tape though, you can go into the red range slightly without noticeable distortion, so in general, you want the material recorded at or near 0 when it's at its loudest, with peaks hitting in the red zone only occasionally. There is no stopping in the red zone. You want the recording to be strong because otherwise you'll hear the noise in the background, but it can't be too strong or it will become distorted. So let's record some music on this tape so you can see what it looks and sounds like. First, we thread the tape we want to record onto. I have a source heading into the tape deck, and here we can see the level meters dancing to its volume. To record, we need to hold down these red tabs while we turn the selector to forward motion. That way it's pretty hard to accidentally record over a tape. I'm going to record it at the middle speed of 3 3/4 inches per second. So to start out, we want the level somewhere around here. We have 2 meters, by the way, because this tape deck records in stereo. Now that we're satisfied with that level, we can begin recording. But now, if we switch the monitor to tape, we'll find that we're not quite recording to the level we thought we were. Variation in the tape and machine can lead to this, and that's why having separate record and play heads is important. So now we can correct the level and we'll get an excellent recording. So what's going on now is the signal it's recording is being boosted by the amplifier in the tape deck and then sent to the record head. This is creating a rapidly fluctuating magnetic field right next to the tape. As the tape passes the heads, the field magnetizes the tape, but with a varying degree over time as the tape moves past it. So the tape becomes a linear representation of the strength of that signal over time. This is representing sound just like the wobbling groove of a phonograph record, only instead of using a physical medium, it's using a magnetic medium. As the newly recorded tape passes the playback head, the varying degree of magnetization as it passes it induces a current in the coil of the playhead, and the current is amplified and sent to both the headphones we're monitoring the recording with and the VU meters that visually show us the strength of the recording. So how does it sound? I'm recording music from YouTube's audio library. This is the source material I'm recording. Now we'll switch it to the tape. You'll hear it briefly repeat as we switch to the tape because of the time it takes the tape to travel from here to here. It doesn't sound that much different from the source, does it? Now, if I stop recording and switch to the fastest speed, you'll see it's even better. Again, here's the source. And now here's the tape. You might be amazed at the sound quality this thing is capable of, and I wouldn't blame you. We all tend to believe that everything is better these days, but we've actually had sound recording figured out for quite some time. Let me show you the problems that a bad record level causes. Here I've got recorded the tape way too soft, with the needles barely moving. If I boost the sound so you can actually hear it, you'll find that there's a ton of noise. That's the tape hiss, and the problem is that the signal we're recording is so weak that it's barely louder than the noise itself. Now if I record with the level too high, the sound starts to turn to garbage. This is what's called recording too hot, and while the sound is bad, it's a different sort of bad. It becomes really distorted. You might be surprised to learn that this tape actually has two sides. When you reach the end, you can unthread the tape, flip both reels over, and you have another side to record onto. This deck, as indeed many consumer decks of the time, records at 3 different speeds. The 2 faster ones are suited for music, at 7.5 inches per second or 30 centimeters for the rest of the world. A standard length tape will hold 30 minutes per side. At half the speed, you shouldn't be surprised to discover that it can record 60 minutes per side. And at the slowest speed of 1 7/8 inches per second, it can record 2 hours per side. But this speed sounds like garbage. Take a listen. This speed was mainly used to record speech or to make a very long recording where quality wasn't important. Since tape had 2 sides, eventually we had recorders that had a feature known as auto-reverse. These machines, like this Ampex, have 6 heads. 3 of them work in one direction, and the other 3 work in reverse. This machine is very high-end, but it's kind of a basket case. Its bias adjustment, which I'll explain what that is in a later episode, is all messed up, and thus it can't record. Also, there's a faulty switch for starting the tape, so you have to press this button to get around that. But it plays tapes fine, and its auto-reverse function still works. When it got to the end of a tape, it would simply reverse the direction of the tape and then switch to the other set of heads. You could either do it manually, like this, or if you recorded an auto-reversing signal onto the tape, the machine could do it automatically, like this. Auto-reverse was more or less a luxury feature, but it did improve the user experience. Perhaps the biggest change tape brought to recording music was editing. Before tape, if you wanted to edit different songs together into a program, you'd need multiple phonographs, a source switching mechanism, and a whole lot of patience. Also, editing mistakes was nearly impossible. If you screwed up a recording, you'd have to throw it out and start all over again. But with tape, you could physically cut out the section you wanted, or didn't want, and piece it together in what's called splicing. Also, professional tape decks could record 4, 8, or even 16 things all at once. Each recording was called a track, owing to the railroad track-like nature of having multiple recordings split along a single tape. These more elaborate recorders used multiple heads and very wide tape, and allowed for musicians to record different instruments and voices on separate tracks, which could then be adjusted individually in a process known as mixing. But before we get too carried away, let's just end with what tape brought us. We finally had high-fidelity, easy-to-use recording equipment, and the advent of multiple tracks brought the possibility of stereo into the home for the first time. Next week, we'll be exploring less of a technology and more of a concept. Our mission next week is to explore stereo sound and high fidelity.
Tape recording uses electromagnetic induction to convert an electrical audio signal, a voltage, into magnetism, which is then used to realign magnetic particles on a reel of recording tape, creating a magnetic representation of the audio waveform. To play back the recorded signal, the reverse is done. The magnetic signal on the tape is converted back into an electrical waveform, again a voltage, which is then sent to the audio console for mixing and processing. Multi-track tape recorders do this independently for every track. Analog recording tape contains magnetic ferric oxide particles suspended in a slurry of chemicals and binders. The audio signal, the voltage to be recorded, is sent to the tape recorder, where it's routed to the record head. This is basically a temporary magnet, or in the case of a multi-track recorder, a stack of independent magnets, one for each track. The record head converts the incoming voltage for a particular track into lines of magnetic force, or magnetic flux. The tape is pulled past the record head through the magnetic flux from the head, which forms at the gap of the magnet for a track in the record head. This magnetic field realigns the particles on tape to correspond to the positive and negative swings of the audio voltage, the audio waveform, creating a magnetic version of that waveform across the length of the tape. After the tape passes through the magnetic flux from the record head, the realigned magnetic particles retain their realignment. This is the actual recording, a magnetic representation of the audio wave, which has been permanently applied to the tape. The magnetic particles consist of domains. On a blank tape, these are randomly oriented, but as the tape is magnetized by the record head, they're reoriented to follow the polarity swings of the incoming magnetic flux, the incoming audio signal. The degree to which these particles retain the new magnetic state depends on the strength of the incoming signal. Weaker signals will realign only some domains, or a correspondingly lower recorded signal level. Stronger signals will magnetize more domains. When all the domains are magnetized, the tape is saturated. Higher incoming signal levels will not be reflected in the recording signal, gently clipping or distorting it at higher audio levels. Excess tape saturation is technically a flaw, but in small amounts it can add a little analog warmth and presence to the signal, and this effect, if managed carefully, is a part of the appealing sound of analog tape. To reproduce, or play back, a magnetic recording, the magnetized tape is pulled past another head, the repro, or playback head. As the magnetized particles on tape pass this head, the magnetic flux from the tape is converted back into a varying voltage. This signal is then sent to an amplifier or mixer for playback or mixing and processing. Since the changing magnetic signal is recorded across the length of the tape, the actual length of the magnetic version of the waveform depends on the speed at which the tape is pulled past the heads. Tape speeds are measured in IPS, inches per second. For professional recordings, the standard speeds are 15 IPS and 30 IPS. Smaller or semi-pro recorders might operate at 15 or 7.5 IPS. 30 IPS provides the best high-frequency response and greatest freedom from audible dropouts, but eats up a lot of expensive open-reel tape, especially in multitrack recording, and requires more robust motors and mechanicals to handle the tape at the higher speed reliably. 15 IPS is a good alternative and offers slightly better low-end response. To make good quality recordings, analog tape recording needs to be a linear process. The incoming waveform must be accurately magnetized on tape and reproduced in playback. However, the process is inherently not linear. A perfect transfer characteristic would be graphed as a diagonal line, as you can see. But when saturation occurs with stronger signals, the response is, of course, nonlinear. Naturally, this can be avoided by simply preventing signal levels from exceeding the saturation point. Less obvious is the inherent nonlinearity of lower-level signals. When the audio signal is strong enough, recording linearity is achieved, but due to the inertia of the magnetic medium, weaker, lower-level signals may fail to magnetize enough domains, resulting in an inaccurate representation of the signal at low levels, which alters the waveform, creating undesirable third harmonic distortion. To remedy this, an inaudible, high-level, ultrasonic, high-frequency signal is recorded on the tape along with the audio signal. This is called the bias frequency. The combination of the weaker, low-level audio signal and the stronger, inaudible bias signal provides strong enough magnetic flux to allow for linear recording of the low-level audio, reducing the otherwise objectionable third harmonic distortion. The actual level of the bias signal applied is a trade-off. The optimum level for minimal distortion may cause the high-frequency response to fall off, so the bias level is set for the best balance between those two considerations based on the tape speed and formulation in use. We'll see how to make this over-bias setting when I cover the tape alignment procedure a little later in the course. Next up, a little more detail on the tape heads.
Stan Gibilisco here to describe the operation of somewhat of a relic these days, an old-fashioned audio tape recorder and playback device. You'll still find a few of these around, maybe more than a few. And some of them even have a reel-to-reel arrangement like an old-fashioned movie projector, celluloid movie projector. But a tape recorder of this sort comprises various components. The key component is a magnetic tape, which I've shown in red, which is about 5 millimeters wide in most cases. You can get it in various thicknesses. You can get it in cassette form or reel-to-reel form. But the basic idea is that audio impulses are recorded on the tape as varying magnetizing the particles on the tape, which are ferromagnetic particles, to a greater or lesser extent as the tape moves by, thereby repeating the waveform, or what is the word I'm looking for? Duplicating or mimicking the waveform of the audio on the tape in the form of magnetic fields of varying densities depending on what was going on in these three heads right here during recording and playback. When you want to record something on this tape, the playback head moves away mechanically from the tape, and the erase head and the recording head come into nearly direct contact with the tape. The erase head, as the tape moves by from left to right, gets rid of any pre-existing magnetic impulses on the tape in case something was recorded on it before, like Tchaikovsky's Fifth Symphony. It erases that so that it's essentially a blank tape when it gets to the recording head, which then records your voice, for example, telling the story of Moby Dick. You're reading Moby Dick into your microphone. You're going to need a lot of tape for that. It goes through an audio amplifier, produces a signal in a coil and magnet device, a transponder, which is in effect an electromagnet that produces a varying magnetic field, magnetizing the particles on the tape. The playback head is moved away so that nothing happens there, and now you've got Moby Dick on your tape. Now when you want to play back Moby Dick, you switch into the playback mode from the record mode. The erase head moves away and the audio amplifier move away mechanically away from the tape and are not activated. But the playback head comes into nearly direct contact with the tape, and it has a very sensitive receptor electromagnet which converts the varying magnetic fields produced by the particles of various magnetic density as they go by, reproducing the waveform if it runs at the correct speed, so it doesn't sound like a speeded up or slowed down version of the story, but like your own natural voice, telling yourself about Moby Dick. Of course, you record in the microphone and you play back through the speaker or alternatively a headset. So a magnetic tape recorder and playback device simply produces whatever sound you want on this sort of celluloid-like stuff, about 5 millimeters wide, sometimes narrower than that in cassette form. And if you've seen them, you've seen them. You know what they look like. If you haven't seen them, well, you don't know how lucky you are to be in the brand new digital age where everything is recorded on digital media, which will be unreadable in 30 or 40 years, thanks to comments made by the vice president of Google, who has told us or warned us about platform incompatibility leading to a digital dark age. So all this stuff, all this yammering I'm doing, all the yammering that everybody did during this great enlightened electronics age of ours, will be lost forever to the cavemen who dwell on Earth in the 27th century AD. They won't even know it's the 27th century. They'll just know that they're hungry and they got to go out and hunt some bear in the forest. Well, it sounds like not a bad life. Wouldn't have to worry about all this stuff. Wouldn't matter anyway. And it'd be a dark age then, too, because there'd be no recording at all of it. Only the hearsay, the stories, the legends, like we have from times gone by. Stan Gibilisco, signing off. Until next time, so long.
I've gathered here on this tabletop some pieces of classic analog sound design equipment. Today everything is digital, it's in a computer, you operate it with a mouse and a keyboard, but back in the day when Louis and B.B. Barron were creating sounds for Forbidden Planet, they had a a studio that was based on magnetic tape. And at that time, sounds were recorded and played back on a roll of magnetic tape. And it would be threaded up on a machine. You could record sounds and wind through it, play it back. You could splice it. It was a physical medium. Like the Barons did for Forbidden Planet, they started out with raw sounds, so electronic sounds. It might have sounded something like this. Well, we'll demonstrate here. First, we'll just by playing a sound on the original tape like this into this machine, we start recording. Put it in playback. We start bringing up the feedback. And unfolding itself into something brand new, sometimes harmonic, sometimes dissonant. Other things you can do, of course, is stop the tape, and the system becomes self-sustaining. Change speed. It's also fun just to crank the speed through by hand at different speeds, so you can get sounds from low frequency to high. Voila.
Today we are going to continue our discussion of the development of music using magnetic tape throughout the world. So last class we looked at France and we also looked at South America, and today we're going to go to Germany and then Japan and then England with the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. Talk first about the development of electronic music in Germany. And in Germany, they tended to call this early electronic music electronische music, so it's easy to kind of translate that. And the earliest developments of electronic music in Germany were all centered at an electronic music studio at the Westdeutscher Rundfunk, which was a big radio station in Cologne, Germany. And from here on out, or I'm going to try to call it WDR, so just to abbreviate it, but you might also hear people refer to it as the VDR, which is how you say WDR with a German accent. So this electronic music studio at this radio station was really the center of the development of electronic music in Germany. So just like we saw in France, radio stations were really important to the development of early electronic music. And something to know about electronic music in Germany is that they were really trying to create their kind of own musical aesthetic, kind of separate from what was going on in France. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more, but that's partly why they come up with this name, electronische music. And so it becomes really synonymous with German electronic music versus musique concrète, which becomes really synonymous with electronic music in France. So a little bit about the early establishment of this studio is that it was founded by two guys, one named Werner Meyer Epler and the other named Herbert Eimert in 1951. And a little bit of their background is that Werner Meyer Epler was a phonetician and a physicist, and he was actually a physicist for the Nazi Party during World War II. And he developed things like radar and other technologies for the Nazi Party. And even though after the war he went through what was called the denazification process, his sort of influence at the WDR and just kind of his general worldview, we can see now there's this like real connection, direct connection between the development of electronic music in Germany and white supremacist ideals and Nazi ideals in Germany. And so that's just something to point out. I think my approach to these kinds of issues in electronic music is rather than kind of ignore it or escape over it, just kind of identify it so that we can kind of move forward in this discussion of German electronic music with that in the back of our minds, and maybe that can kind of color how we think about these developments and maybe the direction that they took. And so that's something that I'd love to talk more about in the discussion section for this lecture, so feel free to chime in with any thoughts about it there. So again, Werner Meyer Epler was a phonetician and a physicist, so he was really influential in developing some of the technologies that were used at the WDR, and he also taught a lot of the composers that worked there principles of phonetics, which really influenced how they thought about creating electronically generated sounds. And a lot of them were kind of interested in recreating human vocal sounds or using ideas of phonetics that, again, were really shaped by Werner Meyer Epler's teaching. And then Herbert Eimert was a musicologist, so he was more of a music historian. And one of the reasons why he was involved is that he created a really popular radio show at the time in which he showcased the music of contemporary German composers. So there was a real strategic move here to identify electronic music with what was the most cutting edge in German composition at the time. And so they were very strategic and very successful because of how strategic they were. So something that's kind of different about the studio in Germany versus the studio in, say, France, is that they took a much more kind of scientific approach, or what I like to call a theory before practice approach. So where Schaefer just kind of went out, made recordings, started manipulating tape or manipulating things on disk and just kind of learned through doing. More of like a heuristic approach. In Germany, it was very much theory before practice. So they wrote papers and they did studies and then they went into the studio and actually applied some of the things that they were thinking about. So again, they considered it a scientific approach. And the other thing that kind of indicates this scientific approach is that they called the studio their laboratory. And part of the reason that they did this kind of makes sense is that a lot of the equipment they were using was scientific equipment. It was equipment used in audiology and other science experiments, but it was also reclaimed war technology. So again, this is a real direct link between electronic music in Germany and basically the Nazi Party. And they also used radio equipment. So like we saw in France and also in the US, they kind of appropriated whatever kind of material they could and adapted it to making compositions using electronic music. So again, we see some of this equipment here. It includes things like oscillators, tone generators, tape recorders, noise generators, and filters. And again, even though they were we'll talk about it now. Basically, what distinguishes electronische music from musique concrète is that these composers were very much about using only electronically generated sound as their sound source. So they were kind of against using pre-recorded sound in general. And this idea was that they would compose electronically generated sound directly to tape and then manipulate the tape. So something that's important to point out is that even though they were using electronically generated sound, magnetic tape and kind of pre-recorded electronically generated sound was absolutely key and central to their techniques. So again, it really relied on recording technology, even though they were sort of propounding the use of electronically generated sounds. Another thing about the aesthetic background is that it's very much linked to this kind of German tradition of serialism. kind of like we saw in France. So with France, there's kind of this link of musique concrète to earlier French music with someone like Satie or things like Marcel Duchamp and his approach to creating art and objectification of everyday things. As similarly, there's this kind of move in Germany where this electronic music is kind of connected to the German music of the past, in the more recent past. So if you remember, we talked about Arnold Schoenberg and this idea of serialism, which is where you assign each of the 12 notes on the piano a number, and then rather than using kind of traditional musical scales, you create your own new scales by just reordering those numbers and using those numbers. And so you create a series rather than using a key. What happened was in the 1930s and 40s, after Schoenberg had kind of created this new musical paradigm, composers started to extend this idea to other musical parameters. So whereas Schoenberg just used it for pitch, composers like his student Anton Webern applied this idea of a series to rhythm and also to timbre. So he created a series of different musical instruments to create what he called a Klangfarben melody or a tone color melody. So he basically created new series of different instrument colors or different timbres. And he also did this with rhythm by equating numbers with rhythms and then reordering them based on this series rather than based on just like his own personal taste. And so we see that this idea of the series becomes applied to more and more musical parameters. And so you can imagine that then with the addition of basically new technologies into this equation, these new technologies with things like oscillators and tone generators gave composers a totally new level of control and a total new level of precision by which they could create these series or control sound, basically. So instead of just having the 12 notes of the piano, you have this 1,000 degrees of frequency that we can create on using a knob on an oscillator. And same with volume and same with, or amplitude, same with where sound moves in space. There's basically all these new parameters that composers could use. And these German composers in particular were very much interested in this idea of like total control over the sounds that they created, for better or for worse. That was what they were looking for. And they wanted to compose the sounds themselves. They wanted to create their own unique electronic sounds as the basis for their compositions. And we'll learn more about that when we talk about Karlheinz Stockhausen. And again, they did this by sort of meticulously recording oscillators and tone generators and things like that, electronic pulses to magnetic tape, and then they Hi everyone. Today we are going to continue our discussion of things like that, electronic pulses to magnetic tape, and then they manipulated the magnetic tape. And so something to kind of point out, because it's often talked about in kind of the literature about electronic music at this time, is that there was this idea of a kind of aesthetic conflict between France and Germany. And I think part of this is that composers and these studios really connected the music that they were making to national identity. And so there was this real kind of nationalistic bent to what they were doing. And it was almost like a duty that if you're a French composer, you made musique concrète, and that was part of being French. And same with in Germany, making electronic music was really connected to ideas about kind of a national culture and national music. This music was also being developed at the time during the early Cold War. So you see that there's this kind of sense of kind of, in this case, friendly competition, where these kind of nationalities are kind of competing to establish kind of cultural dominance over the other. And again, I say friendly because what we see, and Stockhausen is a good example, is that in actuality, by and large, these composers were talking to each other and were aware of each other's music and supported each other's music and listened to each other's music, even though there was this idea of kind of aesthetic rivalry between the two. And something else to kind of mention with total serialism and electronic music is that in post-World War II Germany, there was this real move away from narrative in music, from meaning in music, from sentimentality in music, towards the scientific and towards the abstract. And as some of you know, the real reason for this is that during World War II, the Nazi Party used the music of Wagner and Strauss and other Beethoven and other German composers basically as propaganda. And I think this move towards the abstract was kind of a move away from that so that their music couldn't be sort of like appropriated for nefarious purposes. However, as we see, it's still sort of tied to German national identity. So it's a really complicated thing that's going on there, that even though they're trying to move away from the kind of nationalism of the Nazi Party, there's still this kind of pull towards connecting the music they're making towards this national identity. So again, this is something I'd love to kind of unpack with you all more in the discussion section if it's something that you're interested in. So our example from Germany is a composer named Karlheinz Stockhausen. And the reason why we're going to talk about Stockhausen is that he's kind of most commonly associated with the studio at WDR. He was the director there from, I think, 1963 to 1977, and he first started working there in 1953. So he was really involved there for decades and really kind of shaped the course of music there. And what we see with Stockhausen very early on is he's kind of a good example of how this rivalry between France and Germany didn't really exist in such stark degrees that people sometimes like to talk about it. So the big indicator of that is that Stockhausen, when he became aware that he wanted to study electronic music, was aware of what was happening at the RDF in Paris and the developments of musique concrète and the use of tape and things there. And he was like, that's where I need to go to study basically tape techniques. And so even though the WDR existed at the time, he chose to go to the RDF in Paris to study musique concrète. And he was there from 1952 to 1953. And he composed a piece while he was there called Etude, which is a piece of musique concrète. So he learned the techniques there. Then, in 1953, he went to the WDR, and that's where he started to learn the techniques of electronische music. So the first technique that he learned and he composed a piece using was called Study Number 1, and he used additive synthesis for this piece. And again, additive synthesis is where one kind of layers sine tones on top of each other to create a unique tone. And they're layered at, different volumes and at different potentially pulses to create a unique timbre. And that, again, kind of maps our kind of understanding of, for instance, like an overtone series. And here we have a quote of Stockhausen talking about how he did this. He said, "A sine wave is recorded on tape, a second, a third, etc. is added. Electronically controlled, each sine wave is given its own intensity curve, and then the intensity curve of the entire complex is more regulated." An intensity curve really just means volume. The duration of the sound is fixed by measuring the tape in centimeters and cutting it. The speed of the tape is 30 or 15 inches per second. Thus, one by one, the sounds are put together and cataloged. When all the sounds for a composition have been prepared on the tape, the pieces are stuck together according to the score, and if necessary, are superimposed again by means of several synchronized tape recorders. So again, that's kind of this process of additive synthesis. And then in study number 2, his next piece, Stockhausen used subtractive synthesis. And you might remember that subtractive synthesis is where one starts with white noise. So again, that's a lot of different frequencies that kind of randomly spaced out. And one applies a filter to it, so that removes bands of frequencies. So that's, again, kind of rather than adding sine tones, you're taking away frequencies from a band of noise. And that creates kind of other unique sounds. So then what we see is his next piece in 1956 combines all 3 techniques. So it combines musique concrète, additive synthesis, and subtractive synthesis. And I'm just going to talk about this piece briefly because it's kind of interesting. And another thing that Gesang de Junglinger relied on was Stockhausen's studies with Werner Meyer Epler in phonetics. So this piece, each of Stockhausen's subsequent pieces was based on what he called a single unifying principle. And the single unifying principle for Gesang de Junglinger was to unify vocal sounds and electronically produced sounds. And so in this case, the vocal sounds that he used, he made a bunch of recordings of a boy soprano singing this piece called Preset den Herrn, which is like a church song. And he then meticulously analyzed those recordings for the phonetic content of the boy's voice, basically. And then what he did was he used electronic sounds to try to re-synthesize the boy's voice, or elements of the vowel sounds and the vocal formants and the different aspects of the boy's voice in the recordings. And this, I think, is indicative of like a real consistent move that people have made using technology. And we see this with Amazon Alexa or Siri or all the big tech companies. They all have wings dedicated to try to synthesize human voices, which is still a huge problem. So it's really interesting that even back in 1956, composers like Stockhausen were really interested in being able to recreate a human voice or a human vocal sounds. So other aspects of this piece that I'd like to highlight are the fact that it was a total serialist piece. So he applied a series based on 6 different numbers to as many parameters of the piece as he could. So including speech, pitch scales, vowels and consonants, formants, volumes, pitch to rhythm, tone to noise, duration, everything he could kind of get his hands on, he applied a series to. And again, the idea was that this would kind of unify the piece. Other things that he used, so again, he used the recordings of the boy soprano, he used sine tones made by an oscillator, electronic pulses, also using an oscillator, filtered white noise, and then he also used a spinning speaker system. So one of the things that he became really interested in, like other composers, is using the way that sound moves in space as kind of a compositional element. And so what he did is he actually had to create this kind of spinning speaker table in which he has a speaker, which, as you can see, connected to a tape player, which would play a recording, and then he had 4 microphones placed around the table, and he would spin the table at different speeds, and each of these microphones would be picked up on a different track of tape to then create the feeling that the sound was actually moving in space. So it's just kind of a really industrious creation on Stockhausen's part. So those are the things I'd like to mention about Gesang de Junglinger. And basically, his creation or composition of these 4 pieces, early pieces, led to his eventual creation of what he called the 4 criteria of electronic music. And Stockhausen thought that these should be the kind of 4 fundamental elements of any electronic composition. And the first 2 are the hardest to understand, so I'll do my best to explain them. But there's also a recording of Stockhausen giving a lecture in 1972 called 4 Criteria of Electronic Music. It's 4 hours long, but he explains basically all these 4 criteria. So I put those on I believe it's the recommended reading page, and I just recommend that you listen to maybe the first 20 minutes of it to just get a sense of kind of how Stockhausen talked about his pieces, and then also get a better understanding of what these criteria actually mean. So the first is called the unified time structure, and it's this idea that the way that we hear tones or rhythm is really just a symptom of our abilities of perception. That basically tones are just rhythms sped up, and rhythms are just tones slowed down. And so he says here, all the differences of acoustic perception can be traced to differences in the temporal structure of the sound wave, the speed of oscillation of the wave, the particular interval, their intensity, a frequency with which the pulsations reach the ear, enable the listener to distinguish differences in pitch, timbre, simultaneity, sound mixtures, and noise. So he basically says that all these things that we perceive, pitch, timbre, noise, etc., are just a symptom of these other things: the oscillation of the wave, the particular interval between frequencies, how loud they are, etc. That basically these all influence our perception. And again, it really kind of boils down to this unified time structure that you could use it throughout a piece. You could use, for instance, one rhythm that was used to make all the tones, and vice versa, use this tone to make all the rhythms, and just it would be basically kind of unified in that way. And that'll become more clear, I think, when you hear the piece. And then the second is the splitting of the sound. And I think this is most clear when we think about additive synthesis. So if you are creating new tones by adding different frequencies, then he also thought there should be kind of a transparency of process by which at one point, if you have a tone, you could kind of peel away the different frequencies, the different sine tones of the tone to kind of demonstrate how that tone was made, or the different frequencies that were used to make up that tone. The third is the multi-layered spatial composition. So again, this is the idea that space should be used as a compositional paradigm. And then fourth is the equality of tone and noise. And this is the idea that tones, what we tend to think of as more pure tones, or something closer to a sine tone, should be used equally with more noisy sounds. So pure noise, or even just noisier tones, and that they should be considered equal. So that's the 4 criteria. I put that lecture on the listening page, and then when we talk about contacta, and when you listen to contacta, hopefully these will become more clear. So your required listening for this section is a piece by Stockhausen called Contacta. And the single unifying principle for this piece is based on the idea of contacts between both instrumental sound and electronically generated sound, and noise and tones. So again, it's this idea of more of a continuum between exploring pure instrumental sound, acoustic instrumental sound, and electronic emulations of those sounds, or just electronic sound in general, and then kind of a continuum between tone and noise. And like you can imagine, as he did with Gesang der Jünglinge for Contacta, Stockhausen, when he started composing this piece, basically just made a bunch of recordings of different instruments, and then really meticulously analyzed those instruments to try to basically be able to recreate them, or elements of those instruments' timbres, using electronically generated sound. And we also see that his interest in phonetics and recreating different vowel sounds and vocal formants is also continued. There are sections in which he sort of emulates those. Again, this was also a serial piece. So every element of the piece, volume, pitch, a continuum from tone to noise, or instrumental sound and electronic sound, were all put on were all serialized, and he used that to organize the piece. And again, we see there's a score. So he does have a pretty traditional idea about how you construct a piece. You create all the elements, and then you put them together according to this score that you created beforehand. So he says. I feel like he probably created at least some of the score after the fact. So that's it for this piece. What I'll do is on your required listening section is I'm going to record a short video of myself walking you through elements of this piece so that you can hear especially the 4 criteria and especially the unified time structuring and the splitting of the sound. So that's it for part 1 of lecture 7, and next we're going to go to Japan to talk about Jaikin Kobo. So in part 2 of the lecture, we're going to be talking about the development of tape music in Japan. So in Japan, in the early 1950s, people in general really looked towards Europe to what the tape music techniques that were being developed there as sort of a model. And what we see is that there's a real kind of cross-fertilization between Europe and Japan, and also, or the West in general, so the United States as well. And what we see in general in Japan is that electronic music studios are developed and established at radio stations. So the NHK and the Bangahoso and the MJB are all established at radio stations. And they, again, really kind of look to the West and to Europe, especially the NHK, which was modeled after the WDR studio. And that's pretty in line with sort of where music education was at the time in Japan. So it was very common, say, if someone went to music school or wanted to get musical training in Japan at the time, by and large, at a university or in an orchestra, people would be taught Western classical music. So Mozart, Bach, Beethoven, all that stuff. And they'd be taught Western musical techniques. And not all Japanese people at this time were psyched about that. And so what we see in 1951 is there was a group of artists. They were made up of lots of different disciplines. So dancers, musicians, playwrights, writers came together and were kind of dissatisfied with this sort of like reliance on Western culture and this integration of Western culture into their sort of mainstream musical training. And they wanted to create sort of a group or a space where they could do their own experimental work that kind of outside of this sort of like Western norms that had been established in Japan. And so they created a group called Jaikin Kobo, and again, I apologize for my accent, or the Experimental Workshop. And again, this was mixed media, so it was visual artists, dancers, playwrights, and musicians, and they came together to create work that was really cutting edge. It was performative, it was experimental, it was very much based on kind of like what these young Japanese people were interested at the time. And again, kind of, it was anti-academic. They were all largely self-taught. And again, it showed a shift away from the kind of Western reliance on Western classical music and culture. So one of the people that founded Jaikin Kobo was this guy here, Toru Takamitsu. And Takamitsu was one of the composers and one of the musicians that was involved in founding Jaikin Kobo. And one thing that's really interesting about him is that he worked for Sony at the time. And because he worked for Sony, he was able to get access to a magnetic tape machine and acquired one for the group. So he was really involved with experimenting with magnetic tape really early on, as early as the late 1940s. So really the same time as Louis and B.B. Barron. So you can imagine that, again, he had access to tape really before it was kind of most people had access to it. And he started experimenting with it and making new techniques. And before we kind of get on with Takamitsu and what he did with tape, I just want to talk a little bit about his career. So he ended up becoming a really internationally renowned composer. And so even though Jaikin Kobo originally started by wanting to kind of break away from Western culture and establish kind of new, young Japanese experimental artwork, basically, He did travel a lot. He lived in the United States for a long time. He was very close with Stockhausen. He was close with Xenakis. He was very close with John Cage. He corresponded with all these composers, and he would work closely with them and correspond with them. So at a certain point in his career, he very much became an international kind of composer. But again, he really sort of represented this very distinct kind of Japanese viewpoint that was kind of not as common at the time. So I mentioned that he got access to this tape machine really early on, as early as the 1940s. And what he says about his early experiments was, one day in 1948, I came up with an idea to bring noise into tempered musical tones inside a busy small tube. A little bit more precisely, I noticed that to compose music means how to signify the stream of sounds which runs through the world around us. So again, he's talking about basically bringing in pre-recorded sound into music. And he said, in 1948, a French engineer, Pierre Schaeffer, invented methods of musique concrète based on the same idea as mine. I was pleased with this coincidence. Music is being refreshed, it is changing, though gradually. And I love how kind of poetically he talks about the idea of bringing musical tones into technology and kind of using technology to experiment with sound. So your required listening for this section is a piece called Vocalism Ai. And Ai in Japanese means love. And what he did for this piece is Takamitsu recorded a man and a woman saying the word Ai over and over and over again in different ways. So sometimes they're speaking it, sometimes they're whispering it, sometimes they're kind of singing it almost operatically. And he recorded, several hours of them saying this word "I." And then out of these recordings, he made a 72-hour-long montage of basically tape-manipulated versions of them saying "I" to create this piece. And it's a really cool piece. There's a YouTube video here in the lecture slides if you want to just click on that, but it's also on the listening page. So go back and listen to Vocalism I. And that, again, is just an excerpt of this 72-hour-long piece that he created. All right, so that's it for part 2 of Lecture 7. Up next, we'll talk about the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. In this last section of Lecture 7, we're going to talk about the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. So the BBC Radiophonic Workshop was founded in 1959, and a little bit of the background of this is that during World War II, women were employed at the BBC to basically replace the men who had to go off and fight in World War II. And then after the war, a lot of these women were kind of able to keep their jobs to one degree or another. And so the BBC Radiophonic Workshop was founded by one of these women, Daphne Oram, who worked at the BBC doing what they called at the time music balancing, which is sort of like being a mixing engineer. So she would take recordings and basically change the levels and change the panning and doing lots of kind of after effects to make it kind of sound good. And she also did a lot of sound effects for radio plays. And she was a real proponent at the time. She was aware of what was going on. I mean, by this point, it was the late 1950s. So the studios in France and in Germany and in Japan and even in the US were pretty well established for making electronic music. And Daphne Oram and other engineers at the Radiophonic Workshop felt like they were behind. And they basically pleaded with the management and said, look, we need to be on the cutting edge, and the cutting edge is using electronic sound to make sound effects and to make music for radio shows and TV shows. And the management was super skeptical. They were very traditional and had pretty traditional separations of labor. For instance, people like Daphne Oram and a lot of the women that worked for the BBC Radiophonic Workshop were kind of considered more like assistants, or they were in jobs where they weren't considered composers. So even though they were making some music, and even though they were making sound effects, they were always considered engineers, or again music balancers, or things like that, where they weren't considered kind of the high level of composers. And again, composition at this time meant basically orchestral music, and so that's what the composers at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop the BBC did. So I think BBC had its like own orchestra, and these composers would compose for it. So it was sort of like, we see this happen all the time, where it was like they needed the composers to justify having the orchestra, and they couldn't wrap their minds around the usefulness of electronically generated sound. So Daphne Oram, to prove to the management that electronically generated sound would be really sort of lucrative and beneficial to the BBC, used some very rudimentary electronic techniques using some equipment that she basically put together herself, to make sound effects for a radio play. And it was a huge success. People wrote in and were like, what were those sounds? It was amazing. We want more. And so that kind of convinced the BBC that they could, okay, they'll establish the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. Fine, you can have your electronically generated sound. But of course, they sort of did it begrudgingly. So it was really poorly funded. They didn't get a lot of the support that they really needed to make it successful. But it existed. And along with that, the sort of lack of funding and lack of support from the overall management, even though they were given things like tape machines and some basic equipment, there was also this thing that was established with the Radiophonic Workshop when it started, called the 3-month rule. And this is one of those things that's just like kind of clearly now just wrong and sexist. And the 3-month rule was this idea that listening to electronically generated sound for too long could be detrimental to one's mental health. So it would basically drive them mad. And the management sort of had this rule that after someone was working with electronically generated sound for 3 months, they could be removed from their position and put on another position at the BBC. And of course, this rule kind of happened to only apply to women. So they only enforced it where women were concerned. This was kind of a way to control and basically gatekeep the women that were at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And it was because of this rule that Daphne Oram was kind of eventually forced out of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop in 1959. Basically, the management came to her and said, look, we're applying the 3-month rule to you. You can go back and do your work as a music balancer. And she was like, not worth it. And she ended up establishing her own studio and creating her own synthesizer called the Oramix machine, which we're going to talk about in a few weeks. So that's a little background there. And the other thing is that the management really kind of curtailed the kinds of music or the kinds of sounds that they could create at the Radiophonic Workshop, and basically made it really clear that the women that worked there in particular weren't composers, and the work that they were doing couldn't be considered composition. And so we have this quote here from Delia Derbyshire, that they didn't employ composers and that they weren't supposed to be composing music. And I think that was partly because, again, they had to justify having this orchestra, but it also had to do with unions, and they'd have to pay them more, and all these really complicated things. So today we're going to talk about a bit about Delia Derbyshire, who worked at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop from 1962 to 1973. And in that time, she composed or created sound for over 200 programs. She also created her own electronic instruments. One of the most well-known is the wobulator, but she also created some really, really well-known sound effects and themes at that time. And one of the big projects that she worked on was Doctor Who. So for those of you that know Doctor Who, she created, for instance, the really famous voice for the Daleks, and other sound effects, including the TARDIS and things like that. So I'll include here under the lecture page, on the page, BBC now has really realized how important the BBC Radiophonic Workshop was, and they now have lots of awesome pages where they have emulations of some of these early instruments that Delia Derbyshire and others created. So I have included that link there so that you can kind of test out these digital emulations yourself. So Delia Derbyshire created the Doctor Who theme, and Doctor Who is this sort of science fiction television show that's one of the longest, I think it's the longest running TV show in history. It started in 1963, and they're still making new seasons and still using this theme song, though kind of slightly different versions. So the way the theme was composed is a little bit complicated, because technically the melody was composed by one of the BBC's composers, Ron Granier. He basically jotted down a melody line and a bass line on an elevator in the matter of minutes. And gave that to Delia Derbyshire, which she then realized electronically. So basically, Delia Derbyshire did the heavy lifting, but of course, Ron Granier was the one credited for composing the song and then also given royalties later. So Delia Derbyshire didn't get any royalties. So this is kind of how this division of labor sort of really materially impacted the people that worked at the BBC. So the idea was that Delia Derbyshire wanted the theme song to sound familiar but different. So she wanted it to be catchy and sound enough like music, but she also wanted it to sound kind of spacey and futuristic. And what's interesting, I think, is that she used both pre-recorded and electronically generated sound. So you can imagine, I think these people that were there at the BBC Radiophonic Workshop early on were really kind of scrappy. They had to make do with all the only like few materials that they had, and so I think that forced them to be really creative. And there's sort of several distinct aspects of this theme song, including the sort of sweeping sine tone melody, and then also this kind of chugging bass ostinato. So those are two things to listen for when you listen later. So that's it for part 3 of lecture 7 and for lecture 7 in general. And next week next lecture we're going to go to the United States and look at the development of live electronic music there.